Good morning. My name is Michaela Miller. I'm the Deputy Superintendent here at OSPI. Welcome on a Saturday morning. I wanted to first start off with just a couple of reminders. You should have received the PowerPoint from Carrie Hurt earlier this morning. All registered participants received that, and we are happy to send out a copy of this to those that email after the webinar. If you have questions, we're going to try to make a webinar like this as interactive as possible. And so we have a chat box, and please post any questions throughout the webinar into the Q&A box that's at the top of your screen. We will be logging those and then answering them at the end of the webinar. So we'll go through those Q&A at the end. So we appreciate providing as much interaction with this as possible as we start to roll out the new plan as it sits right now. So a little bit of background for everyone. We put the new consolidated plan, ESSA plan, online about 10 days ago, 11 days ago, open for public comments. This past Thursday, the 17th, we delivered the ESSA plan to the governor for his review. That is a 30-day process, so we have a little bit of an overlap. It provided us time to receive public comment and provide any of that public comment to the governor for his review as well. So we staggered that release and are working closely with the governor's office to make sure that he has what he needs as he's reviewing the plan in preparation for our submission, which is September 18th. There we go. So we wanted this morning to start with the why. Where we're at right now, it's a lot to do with where we've been with accountability and federal accountability, federal programs over the last 20 years or so. We're at a place right now where we're trying to talk less about No Child Left Behind and more about where we're going, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. There are 4 components of that that we are going to highlight, but there are lots of pieces of the plan that we're actually going to go through today. And as you read the plan, you'll see that it's a very comprehensive look at education from a federal, and then we'll talk about some of the impact on the state programs as well. So starting off, the core fundamental principle for our superintendent is an emphasis on equity and looking at growths and gaps in all areas. ESSA provides us an opportunity to look at growth and gaps in areas that we haven't shined a light on before around things that are non-cognitive pieces of education. And so that door was open to us, and we are, just like all other states, taking a step through looking at a broader set of measures in order to support schools, intervene in schools, and then ultimately support students. The other piece, or important principle, is a continuous improvement of all schools. So all schools, regardless of where they're at, big, small, rural, suburban, have gaps, and we know that exists. All educators know that there are things that we can do to improve and reduce gaps, achievement gaps, opportunity gaps for students. And so we're really taking a frame of continuous improvement for all schools. This offers everyone an opportunity to look at subgroups within their schools, analyze what needs the students have, and then be able to support them with either financial support resources, but also with training, professional learning, and other things that will help close those achievement and opportunity gaps. The third big principle is around obtaining and retaining effective educators, elevating the work of accomplished teachers, accomplished principals, district administrators, to make sure that we have the HR personnel that we need to do the work that has to be done with the new ESSA implementation plan. So that is a key component and specific work in one of our work groups. Finally, ESSA provides an opportunity to have new and yet unexplored flexibility on use of resources. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the PowerPoint. But we're at an interesting turning point, both with federal law and with the McCleary work that's been done with funding. And that is that we're able to, with the flexibility of ESSA, think about resources more integrally. We're looking at braiding and blending funds. Gail's going to talk about that a little bit later. But that's an opportunity that hasn't presented itself to us in the way it has now. And so we're excited that we're taking a look at that both at the state level and then helping districts to think about what that looks like on the ground. As we think about what's happened up until this point, there's been really two phases of work. The first phase happened prior to January, prior to Superintendent Rakedahl coming into office, and there was a ton of stakeholder involvement, work groups that were thinking about the different elements of the plan, a lot of prep work that went into it from around the country. The word on the street is that Washington did it better than almost anyone else in terms of stakeholder involvement, stakeholder engagement within those work groups. So that is something we tried to carry through in the spring, really doubling down on the areas that we needed to focus on, particularly around the accountability piece of this. And we're gonna go through that. Those pieces that we updated really carefully this morning. A lot of the plan really did not have a ton of change, although there was a process of looking at all the first round of public comment, getting those back to the work groups, and then re-looking at those. So it has been an evolving process, but one that we're really proud of the amount of and involvement from stakeholders and community as well as educators. So one of the big shifts that we wanted to make sure everybody had in their minds as they're listening to this presentation, especially those that are getting re-engaged in the ESSA Consolidated Plan, is that when the shift in administration at the federal level, particularly when Secretary DeVos took over the Department of Education, she decided to put forth a revised state plan template for states to use. Well, many states were already in the final stages of their submission and ready to actually hit send and send to the Department of Ed. And so at that point, we had a decision to make whether or not to use the old state plan template or shift to the new revised state plan template. Ultimately, Superintendent Rakedahl decided to move to the revised state plan template after consultation with us and others, especially around the country, as people were thinking, as other states were thinking about what to do. We did know and got information back from the Department of Ed that they really wouldn't be looking at any of the anything that was not on the revised template. They would not be reviewing any of that or giving any feedback on that. And so in order to send just what the department wanted, we decided to shift that. So you will see, if you're familiar with the original plan, you'll see that it looks a little bit different because we have shifted to the revised template. Both documents will help to guide what we do, though, in the implementation, and both are on our website, so you can see. And in fact, we have made efforts to show you the differences between the old plan and the new plan. So I already talked a little bit about the public comment and submission timeline, but I just wanted to go over this with specific dates. We are putting forth another 30-day public comment period, and that started again on August 7th, and it will run through September 5th. We started the clock for the 30-day review from the governor's office on August 17th, which was just this last Thursday, and that will run through September 17th. We provided that little bit of overlap so that we had an opportunity to gather as many public comment submissions as possible prior to sending it to the governor, so he could review both any public comment that had come in as well as the consolidated plan draft. Finally, on September 18th, we will submit the final draft of our ESSA plan to the Department of Education. This slide represents the broad range of different programs that are covered in the ESSA plan, and so you can see many of you that have been to some of these webinars before have seen this. This is just a reminder of the different elements of the plan, the vast different programs that are impacted by this plan, and just a reminder that the work group work that was done last year was critical to getting us to this point with many of these elements. So we want to shift right now to talking specifically about some of the pieces that were updated since January, and in particular the accountability indicators that are required, federally required for our Title II Part A, particularly around our school improvement and our accountability index that we have in the state. One of the desires before January was to really think about having a single statewide index, something that would cover the state, cover all schools, something that people could point to and that was not necessarily different than another accountability index that someone was using. So we partnered with the state board and did this work together with a group called the Accountability Systems Work Group. By January, that group had put forward a recommendation to Superintendent Dorn around the actual indicators. And you can see that the indicators and the school quality or student success indicators present the state with a much broader range of indicators that we're looking at in order to look at school improvement. And so if you move from the left to the right-hand side, you'll see everybody's pretty familiar with the proficiency on state assessments, the ELA and math. That has been around for quite a long time, as well as graduation rate. But moving right from there, we also include student growth measures, English learner progress, and then it is required, ESSA requires us to choose school quality or student success indicators. And that was some intentional work done by the Accountability Systems Work Group, the ASW, to identify indicators that we had available to us that were broad enough to cover. There were some requirements about what those indicators should be in ESSA, but it did provide us some flexibility as we looked at what we were going to actually use. Our state has already done quite a bit of work around absenteeism. We continue to refine that definition and process, as well as dual credit, advanced course taking, and ninth graders on track. We actually look very similar to a lot of states in terms of those measures. Most states are using some sort of measure around chronic absenteeism, and then most states are looking at some sort of post-secondary attainment or post-secondary high school kind of dual credit. And so we're really in the same mix as other states in terms of just starting out down this road of school quality and student success indicators. So those were identified, and then the work this spring has been around really refining those with a technical advisory committee to identify get into some of the business rules and really get into the definitions of some of these. So ESSA provides us an opportunity to broaden the amount of indicators that we're looking at, but that's also presents us new opportunities and definitely some new challenges too, as we think about how do we report these, how do we support schools, how do schools intervene around some of these indicators. So one of the analogies I've been using is from the No Child Left Behind, more punitive hammer approach. And yes, this is still an accountability system, so that isn't lost on us. But we're really thinking about data, the access of data, the dissemination of data as shining a flashlight on the work that we have to do together with schools. ESSA provides a shared accountability model with the state and districts taking a lot of that responsibility together. And so instead of everything being a hammer approach to indicators and punitive, we're really trying to shift that to how can we make this more of an approach of shining a light on data and working alongside districts as they're implementing their school improvement plans attached to these indicators. So we're going to take a deep dive now into the new accountability information related to the consolidated plan. I want to just make another comment here that we've been working closely with the State Board of Education on this. This has been something that's been a shared work with them, their staff. We just had a special board meeting this last Wednesday where some of the issues were discussed, and we have continued work to do around that, but we have been doing this alongside the State Board because, I'll reiterate it again, we do want to have a unified system of accountability in the state. So as we think big picture about the accountability system, the ultimate goal of all of this is meaningful learning for kids. And if that isn't our through line, then we need to make some changes, because the emphasis has to be on ultimately on an impact on student learning. And we do that through building that professional capacity and that resource accountability. And so those things, all three of those things need to work in tandem together in order to have that approach to continuous improvement. So when I think about an accountability model and moving to a flashlight approach, it is an accountability and continuous improvement system rather than just a accountability system. So that's the way we're shifting. And I think ESSA provides us a framework to at least set that up in the Washington way. I'm going to turn it over now to Deb Kame, who's going to talk through some of the particular pieces of the old versus the new draft on the accountability systems model.
Okay, good morning. I'm Deb Kame. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Assessment and Student Information. And as Michaela noted, I'll be walking through some pieces of the accountability system. And just kind of, first I'm going to just establish the framework, and then we'll kind of tie in various components of it as I go. So in the previously and in the old draft of the plan, it described the Washington Achievement Index, which produced a summative score, which was based on a weighted combination of measures, and it was scored on a scale from 1 to 10. So under the new draft, it is similar. The measures are still on a 1 to 10 scale, but each measure will now be spread out a little bit differently. So it's going to be spread evenly. The number of schools will be spread evenly between 1 through 10. So on each measure and collectively, there will be a score from 1 to 10. One approach here is that the scores, the differences, will be kind of set and frozen based on the all students category in the initial year that we do that, which will be using data from 3 years, 14, 15, 15, 16, and 16, 17. So the new model will combine data from 3 years for each measure, and then those measures will be combined for a summative score. So again, a couple of things about this. So by combining multiple years, we get more inclusion. We're able to include more small schools or small subgroups and transparency. And then again, kind of reiterating that there will be a score of 1 to 10 on each measure for all students and for subgroups of students. So kind of looking at it in a visual way, so we have the various measures. We have the proficiency, growth, English learner progress, graduation, and school quality or student success. So we have these different measures, and we'll be combining those measures to identify the lowest performing 5% as outlined in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So each measure will have a score, a number between 1 and 10, and those numbers get combined to get an overall picture. And then to determine the lowest performing 5%, right now that score is around a 2.5 in the drafts that we've done so far, the modeling we've done. It's somewhere in in the twos, and there are around 5% of schools below that threshold. So we're going to establish that bar for all schools and identifying it. And those schools that are below that threshold will be the comprehensive support schools. And so one thing I'll talk about in the next couple of slides is that that same threshold, wherever it is, currently somewhere in the twos, around 2.5, that same threshold will be used for targeted support, for identifying subgroups that need additional support. So in other words, there's going to be a uniform threshold of performance. So looking at how are schools and subgroups compared, and how do we identify schools in need of additional resources. So previously, the Department of Education specified how many schools needed to be identified, and we would use a composite score and sort of identify them. And subgroups were identified based on a stacked ranking and identifying the lowest performing on proficiency on ELA and math. And so the new structure that we have allows the lowest performing threshold to be based on the all students category. And so we're moving away from that to a standards-based approach. So using the similar threshold, the same threshold for subgroups as we are for all schools or all students. So any school or subgroup within a school that doesn't demonstrate that standard, that threshold, will be identified for support. One thing to note here is that there isn't a limit to the number of schools that could be identified. Previously, under the Department of Education specified how many would be identified, but here it's based on a standard threshold. And how do student subgroups factor into the accountability system? So under the old system or under the previous draft plan, the school is given one achievement index score, and that combined information for certain targeted subgroups as well as the all students. Under this draft, rather than combining the scores of the all students into subgroups, the scores are kept separate. Individual subgroups can be identified for support based on the same threshold. So this more clearly illuminates subgroups that are in need of additional support. It's more explicit about how we see information for subgroups within particular schools. So let me kind of walk through how that works. We saw the bar before about trying to see how schools might be identified, as thermometer, if you will, and establishing a threshold for comprehensive support. So we set that line that represents the lowest performing 5% of schools. And that same bar will be used to look at particular subgroups. So in this particular example, there are 4 subgroups that have their combined score, the multiple measures score, that are below that threshold, and they would be identified for targeted support. So one way to think about this is a Rubik's Cube.
Because it's the way I think about it. So one way that I've been trying to explain to folks is that around the targeted approach is that we have now, it's more complex in terms of not getting to a single summative score, but if we are going to measure, differentiate, and support, we need to identify and disaggregate that summative score. And so as you think about the targeted approach, you think about a series of indicators, chronic absenteeism, ELA proficiency, graduation rate, etc. And you think about the individual subgroups. And so every school, every district can take an approach of, and we'll have a couple of examples here, of a dashboard approach to kind of turning the dial to see which indicators are particular subgroups of students having the most problems with, or underachieving or underperforming in. And so this is an opportunity to disaggregate, differentiate, and then attach the level of support appropriate for that particular subgroup. And each one, as you know, if you've been in the classroom, you know that different kids need different supports. At a school level, the kids across your school need different supports depending on the grade level, depending on their absenteeism, depending on their test scores. And as you're thinking about that, you differentiate as a classroom teacher. It's taking that same approach more at a systems level and thinking about where are the gaps, and then how can I attend to those gaps, regardless of whether you end up on the targeted quote list or not. There is now an approach every school can take to differentiating through those measurements and then turning that into support.
So one way in looking about, we've talked about the measures and how they'll be combined for a score and differentiating. So here is one possible mock-up about how information might be displayed to convey about how which areas need the most focus, or which subgroups need the most focus. So here's one way to do it, where we have two different illustrations and they go kind of side by side. The measures at the top represent performance by indicator. So this might be a view of a school, and it's going to show across the different measures roughly how a school is doing. So for example, the top bar there is the English language arts proficiency, and it's at 68%. And so then it shows each the performance on each of the other measures, and some indication by color that kind of indicates where it is on the 1 to 10 scale. So just to give a sense of the overall performance. And these indicators can be filtered by subgroups. So the one that's showing here is just for the all students group, but one could filter and see the different information across indicators for any particular subgroup. So we see the performance by indicator at one level, and then down at the lower bars, the lower charts, there would be a view across any particular indicator, and you can see it by subgroup. So you can look across and say, okay, for English language arts proficiency, the far left bar there is 68.7, corresponding to the same bar at the top, but you can see the performance within any particular subgroup as well. So you can look across indicators, and you can look across subgroups, and then you could change and view a different measure if you would like. So by doing it this way, you can highlight the performance. This school is generally high performing, but you can also identify those subgroups that are more challenged and maybe need more support. So this is just another view, another school where you can see where they're a different level of performance, and you can see it's just a different view, but it gives you a quick picture of the multiple measures. So another difference in the approach to the accountability framework is around the graduation rate. So previously, the Achievement Index, as well as for federal accountability, Washington has used the 5-year cohort rate, so looking at the percentage of students who graduate within 5 years. So under the Every Student Succeeds Act, it requires that the 4-year grad rate be included, but it also gives the flexibility to include the extended graduation rate, that is students who might graduate in 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years. So the previous draft included those by kind of combining them into a composite graduation score. Under the revised approach, it uses the 4-year graduation rate to determine the initial starting place on the 1 to 10. But then it looks at those schools or populations that have a relatively high extended graduation rate and kind of gives a boost, a little bump to the score of maybe 1 or 2 units. And what this approach does is to acknowledge both the performance on the 4-year rate, because that's the base, and it gives those schools or populations that are successful in increasing their extended graduation rate. So it recognizes that there are some schools that serve more challenged populations, and they might be graduating more students in the 5th year, 6th year, or 7th year. Another change from the previous draft is looking at the English learner progress definition. So how does that get included, and what is the definition? So previously, under No Child Left Behind or Adequate Yearly Progress, the English learner programs had a separate system for monitoring progress. And the timing of our previous draft plan did not specify the English learner progress measure, because our assessment was relatively new. It was first administered in 2016, and this year was our 2nd year of administering the English language proficiency assessment, or ELPA 21. So this year, just in the last couple of months, we've got data to measure English learner progress. So what is being proposed is to look at the percentage of students who are making enough progress to transition out of the program within at most 6 years. So it's establishing kind of a timeline of 6 years as the expectation at most, but the specific number of years expected for a student can vary depending on that student's initial testing level. So for example, students with a relatively high initial level will be expected to transition out of services faster than students who come in at a lower English proficiency level. So this is just kind of a table that can illustrate how that works. So the ELPA 21, the English learner English language proficiency test, has looks at students, the profile of an English student, and looks at their reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And students, in order to transition out, they need to demonstrate proficiency in each of those areas. So a student who's entering at a very low level in each domain, a level 1 or 2, in each of the reading, writing, listening, and speaking, that we might expect that it could take up to 6 years to transition. But even within that, it's expected that they're making progress along the way, that they might start from an emerging level, but then they might move up to progressing within the 2nd or 3rd year. So the measure within accountability kind of looks at where a student started and if they're moving along the path to transitioning. Okay, what about science? How is science included in accountability? Previously, science was included in the achievement index, but the proposal under the new draft is not to include it as we are transitioning to the assessment of the next generation science standards. So those standards the test on those will first be administered in the spring of 2018, that is this coming school year. And so given the change in standards and of what we're measuring, we are proposing that we won't include it now, but we will include it in the next iteration of identifying schools, and so that would be in 2021. And that allows us to implement the assessment under the next gen science standards, and we will have 3 years of data at the next round. So just kind of a recap of those things that are changed or different on the plan. So we have a new English learner progress definition. That's because we have new data, and we've also gotten a lot of input from our stakeholder groups, as well as comments from across the nation as all states are trying to kind of wrestle with how to include the English learner measure and accountability.
And I would just say BAC is a major player with all of this work as well.
Yes. Yeah, the BAC group has been involved in that. We also have a slightly different approach to giving extra credit for strong extended graduation rate performance. Looking at how do we spread school performance across 1 to 10. We're spreading it out more evenly, and this helps to differentiate schools. And we also have a uniform threshold of performance. We're applying the same thing to schools as we are to each subgroup rather than combining them into a single score. This gives a little bit more transparency and visibility to individual subgroups. And then also science will not be included until 2021. So these are just some of the changes to the draft plan that was published last fall. So we will now take a break and address some of the questions that are coming in.
All right, I'll walk through some of these. The first one, how does a negative outcome of chronic absenteeism or ninth graders on track appropriately identify the quality of a school or student success indicator? And then why do positive inputs continue to be excluded from the ESSA plan? So good questions. I think we've been wrestling with that. I know the ASW, the Accountability Systems Work Group, definitely wrestled with those questions as well. So just right off the bat, I wanted to say, keep in mind that we are dealing with state measures and that some of the things that are rolled up, we have a more limited number of those than, for example, you could actually attach to your school improvement plan or at a district level. So this is the state accountability plan, but we really want to emphasize that this has to be in conjunction with the kinds of data and work that you're doing at both the school and the district level. So it is a combination. However, I understand the visibility of this is quite large, and so we are trying to get this right. So think about this in two ways as you think about measures outside of academic indicators. Opportunity to learn, because that's a huge component of this, and engagement. So when you think about our opportunities to learn, those include kids getting to school, staying in school, being in school. The number of days a student attends school is positively associated with student achievement and graduation, period. So we know when kids are in school, they have an opportunity to learn. I also want to couch this too in the place that the ASW and OSPI and the state board are also recognizing that because these are new indicators, they are relatively low impact on the entire accountability system. So we want to make, this is not going to be a system where you are identified only because of chronic absenteeism. That is not the way that this is being approached. They do have to count within the accountability system, but they are far less of an impact than the achievement, the ELA and math proficiency, growth, and graduation rate. And that's actually by federal law. They're supposed to weigh less. So we are taking a first step in this. I think there was a real emphasis in the ESSA development as a federal law to do a couple of important things to keep in mind. One, broaden the measures beyond what we were looking at with No Child Left Behind, and give states more flexibility in how we're evaluating and holding schools accountable. So I think keeping those two things in mind, the flexibility we have is that this is an ongoing process. We're going to learn from this. We are going to learn as we go through a year and are promising to come back and evaluate how we're doing. We've actually been keeping track of absenteeism for now going on 3 years. So we have a good amount of data to look at. And that's one of the reasons that opportunity to learn and engagement is so critical. And it's actually something that is broader than just Washington State. Most states are looking at this as well. In terms of the success indicators and positive indicators, I'll say two things about that. One, they spent a lot of time on the ASW, which was a broad group of stakeholders. 40% of those stakeholders were non-educators, were not from districts or from schools or from OSPI. They were community stakeholders. And as we tried to look at the issues around positive outcomes, there were other elements that were looked at. For example, seal of biliteracy, or how many apprenticeship programs are connected to your high schools. I think we attempted to get at those positive indicators with the dual credit, for example. That is how are schools providing more opportunities for dual credit and advanced course taking. And so I think those two pieces are really important to think about as we're moving forward. We will also, I just also wanted to remind you that this isn't a measure of our students, but rather a measure of our system as a whole. And so as we're thinking about how schools are moving forward in developing their own school improvement plans, it will always be a combination of these big A accountability measures, and then what are you doing at the school level, at the district level, and what measures are you going to be looking at over time for improvement. Okay. It's a work in progress, people, so we're going to get there. Why are we continuing to use No Child Left Behind era summative scores to stigmatize or shame our schools to compare poor rural or urban districts to well-funded and suburban areas? So there is, and I really invite everybody to read the ESSA accountability, the actual law, because it does require the state, all states, to write an accountability framework for their state. So that's a requirement. As we move forward, we're trying to make it as applicable to Washington State as possible. As you think about, and we just had a meeting this week, as you think about the tension between summative scores, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the disaggregation, and we'll continue to do that. As we move forward as a state and create our data dashboard, we are really focused on the disaggregated data, and we'll continue to do that. In order to identify the required bottom underperforming 5%, we are creating an index that would identify those 5%. But as you've seen through Deb's presentation, the focus is for targeted is on the individual subgroups and indicators where you have to disaggregate. So if you think about what this is going to visually look like, it is going to look more like a dashboard of different elements, different indicators, rather than identifying schools through a summative score. In our report card work group, we made it clear that using colors to score schools or groups of students stigmatize our most vulnerable populations. Is OSPI considering labeling white student populations in an aesthetic blue, while Black and Latino student populations are highlighted in negative, threatening red or orange? No, we appreciate the comment, and we are, again, we have the work group recommendations that actually were used and are being used in the development of our overall wireframe for what the dashboard is going to look like, and we appreciate your comment and assure you that the work group recommendations are being used to create that wireframe as we move forward. What would comprehensive support look like? What kind of supports would be provided? Those are great questions and ones that we're working on over the course of this year. Reminder to everyone that the implementation of this whole system goes into place for the 18-19 school year. So this fall, our school improvement office will be actually visiting schools that are currently in priority and focused, and meeting and doing school-based interviews and site visits in order to better understand the kinds of support that we need to afford schools as they're thinking about this new system. So great question. We actually have a memo that went to the governor's office and to the state board outlining the next steps with the school improvement development. How would the targeted support for subgroups empower those groups instead of making them feel like they're stupid or less than? That's another great question, I think embedded in the answer that I just gave, which is we are, our Office of System and School Improvement, led by Tennille Jeffrey Simmons, who is actually, I think, driving across the state right now, will be looking at how do we best support the work of school districts in a new era of ESSA that requires a couple of important reminders. And this is hard because you're shifting away from something that we've been doing for a long time, which is shared accountability with the district and the state. So districts will have more of a say in funding, more of a say in how they go about school improvement. So that's a first really important reminder. And then the second one is that this will look more like an approach where we have work around the state that is perhaps both federally and state funded, because reminder that we can think about funding differently in the future, looking at how we're approaching something like chronic absenteeism as an indicator across subgroups, but utilizing both state resources that have gone into chronic absenteeism as well as federal support. So we really are thinking about the system more as a whole instead of just a separate program.
So I just want to add a little bit on some of those things that Michaela was describing around how we plan to display data. So talking about the maybe an opportunity to learn dashboard, or providing more context around schools. So that was quite a bit of the input that we've received, and we'll be continuing to work on how we display information, not just those pieces that you see within this accountability framework. These are pretty well guided or defined to some degree by the federal government, but they also, we're going to try to portray additional context about schools or what their situations are. That's a lot of the feedback that we've gotten. So we'll be working to revamp our report card, which will connect some of the things that are currently disconnected. So something like our current report card that has a lot of information, but we'll be embedding this multiple measures or this index in that system and highlighting measures individually, but we'll also be connecting some of the performance indicators that have been done, as well as these pieces of ESSA, but also some additional context information about educators, or it could be the school environment or fiscal situations for schools or districts that gives a broader picture of a school.
Okay, and then the last question before we move on. Oh no, I lied. There's two more. Why is the importance of science only being measured by an upcoming standardized test in the accountability system? What other measures can schools be held accountable in providing authentic and relevant instructions for students to display proficiency? Great question. So the science piece is pretty straightforward. We have a new science assessment in place. And one of the challenges, again, is at the state level, something needs to be uniform across the state. And so you have your hands are tied then, and believe me, I understand from a classroom perspective the need to have local assessments, benchmark assessments. We have to rethink this accountability system as a partnership and a shared responsibility of local measures and state measures. And so when we were analyzing the science in particular, what we have up until this point, and if we were to go back 3 years of accountability measures with science, we would have end of course, which is not a direct link connection, very good applicability to next year's next gen science broader assessment. And so I think we made a smart decision moving forward that we would not include a measure that was not relevant to what we will be collecting in the future. And so I think that was that is something we discussed with the state board. They approved that, and I think it was a smart move for us to approach this science piece cautiously. But in terms of your second part of that question, I think you're absolutely right. This is where the district comes in and the school comes in, and you're and as a classroom teacher, I know relevant interim, benchmark, and classroom assessments have to be combined with what you see at the state level. So I think it is a shared accountability responsibility from that point. Okay, next question is, are the types of targeted supports determined by the state, district, school, combination of them? Exactly, combination. So this will be, again, I know it's going to be hard to reframe school accountability in this way because so much of it has been a state-directed thing for the last long time, 20 years. But reframing this as a shared responsibility between the district and the state. It will also be a shared resource accountability too. So your accountability for resources will be at the district level. So I think it provides a tremendous opportunity to do things that are connected to what we're already doing as a state. But that targeted support has to be and will be a combination of what state supports are provided and what district and school supports are provided. Last question, how do any of the multiple measures ID the qualities of schools in the wait, I think I already,
Yeah.
Oh, I think we already answered that one. So we talked about positive. We will continue to look at that. It is, I know, a important priority for the superintendent to think about positive elements that we are building in, not just to this accountability framework, but to the broader dashboard. Because as Deb said, we have the opportunity as a state, yes, we will have the accountability measures, indicators on there, but we also have the opportunity to add other indicators that may not fall within the particular federal accountability system onto that dashboard. And so we're going to be intentional about putting those positive outcomes for schools on there as much as possible.
Okay, so I'm going to walk through a few more pieces of the plan. We kind of touched on those areas that were different or new from the previously proposed plan last fall, but now I'm going to just touch on a few other components of the plan within in the new version is section A around accountability. So part of what the ESSA asks for is about native language assessments, and so it asks for the definition of languages that are other than English that are present to a significant extent. And so we have defined that as being those that exceed 1,000 students in the state. And so from our data from last year, there were 12 languages that fell under that definition, and these are listed in order of frequency. So continuing with that, so what we currently offer, the Smarter Balanced Mathematics Assessment, which is in grades 3 through 8 and 11, it has a full translation in Spanish. There are also a number of languages that are available in a glossary-based feature for both math and English language arts. And it translates just items. It has sort of a hover capability to translate certain words or terms. And that's available in 11 different languages. We are considering or exploring having assessments available in multiple other languages, but it's something we're just working on now. So just a recap of what's required for federal reporting. So we need to require on the major racial and ethnic groups, and there are 7 of them, and they're bucketed by the federal categories. They fit that. And then there are also 3 additional groups that are required to be included in accountability. That's low-income students, special education, and English learners. So that on some of the slides we were looking at earlier about the different subgroups, these are the ones that we were talking about. So, but kind of going beyond that, about what can we go beyond that for reporting? And so we also intend to publicly report state level information around more detailed race and ethnic categories that are collected within our system. So we have more detailed information within categories such as like within the Asian category, we have more specifics, or within Pacific Islander. And we'll also be working on collecting and revamping that a little bit within just a report that was just published this year. So we're looking to do more detailed reporting within those 7 major federal categories. So the Every Student Succeeds Act allows an exception to be applied to recently arrived English learners. That is to say, it doesn't, if a student has just arrived and they're an English learner, about taking an assessment, particularly in the English language arts area. And so it allows us to, ESSA asks, how do the states want to handle that? And we've proposed a hybrid approach that's student-centered, allowing districts to decide on the best approach for their students. And so they have an option sort of to make a decision based on the student, whether or not to take that assessment in that first year based on several features such as the performance on the ELPA 21 screener when they arrived, how proficient is the student, what's their English proficiency level, but also based on just local assessments, knowing the student based on their classwork and parent and teacher input to determine whether or not it's appropriate to provide that assessment to the student in that first year. So we'll be taking an approach where the student may not test in that first year, or they might. In any event, it is not required that their English language arts assessment be included that first year, and then the second year, for accountability purposes, it could be their growth or their proficiency, and then in the year following, in either event, both proficiency and growth would be included. So it just allows a little more flexibility at the district level as to whether or not they test that student in that first year if they've just arrived as an English learner. So another area that's specified in ESSA, it asks states to talk about their minimum N size. And that's sort of slang or shorthand for saying, well, how many students do you need to be included in the accountability system or for reporting? So our approach will be to combine 3 years of data for accountability purposes, and then the combined minimum number, that is over those 3 years, is going to be 20. And so this method, we think, maximizes the inclusion of historically underrepresented subgroups, but it still meets the requirements for being statistically sound and for maintaining student privacy, so having not information that's so small that it might compromise an individual student's performance. So just to give an illustration of that, so looking on the left side of this screen and what our current reporting requirements are. So on the report card, 10 is the minimum number of students where we can actually show data based on state law. And this won't change from what's been done historically for public reporting. So in this example, the far left there, the 5 students who are gray, if there are just 5 students in a particular measure, we won't show that on our report card. But if there are 10 students, as it was in year 2 here, we are able to show that. That's the minimum number that we can report. But then in the third year here, again, there are another 5 students that third year, and we wouldn't be able to show it. So for just reporting purposes for a single year, we would only show that second year. But for accountability purposes, we will use 3 years of combined data. So we have 5 and then 10 and then 5. So that meets the 20 minimum number to be included for accountability. So this approach, by combining the 3 years of data, is more inclusive than previously, both on report card and also what we've used previously for under adequate yearly progress and also under the achievement index. And that means that the outcomes for more students will be included in determining which schools need the most support. So just kind of a recap of the different measures or indicators that are included. We've touched on all of these earlier, looking at academic achievement as it's outlined in ESSA. And that's looking at the percentage of students who are proficient or at a level 3 or 4 in our smarter, balanced English language arts and math tests. There's also a measure of academic progress, and for that it is our student growth percentiles. And that looks at students who are between 4th and 8th grade on the statewide assessments in English language arts and math. Graduation rate I've touched on earlier. It's got the 4-year base plus some extra credit for extended year. And then we have the English language proficiency assessment and its progress in that area. So there's percentage of students who are making enough progress to transition out within 6 years. And then we have 3 measures within the school quality or student success, and that's the regular attendance or chronic absence is the flip side of that. Also the percentage of 9th grade students who are on track, or that is to say that they're passing all of their attempted credits, they're earning credit in all of the classes, and the percentage of students who completed a dual credit course or program. So another part of the Every Student Succeeds Act is the long-term goals, and it specifies that we need to establish a statewide long-term goal, as well as having goals for the schools and subgroups, and it requires those in 3 different areas. In the academic achievement, that is to say the proficiency measures in English language arts and math, as well as graduation, and for the English learner progress. So the long-term goal is within that we've established is in 10 years. So by 2027 is to have 90% of students proficient in this chart is for English language arts, but the same would apply for math as well. So the emphasis here is that looking at that for each school and for each subgroup that they attain that 90% rate. That means that there is more growth is needed, more progress is needed for students or for the subgroups that have historically had lower performance, and those are the areas that require additional attention and focus, so possibly the targeted support areas. So here's another way of looking at that. The chart is just looking at what are the annual increments needed to achieve that target of 90% in 2027. So some of the groups have more progress to be made at annual increments. This is a similar illustration, but this is for math, but the same approach. And for graduation, another picture is looking at in 10 years from now, a 90% graduation rate, and looking at the increments needed to achieve that. So also recognize that in some schools or for some subgroups for graduation or for proficiency, they may already be at a 90% rate, and the expectation is continuous improvement, continuing beyond that. So finally, just touching on, I think I touched on these earlier about the school quality or student success indicators. The 3 of them are listed there. So looking at the comprehensive support and improvement, I will turn it over to Michaela.
All right, so I'm going to touch on this. As I mentioned to Neil, Jeffrey Simmons is the Assistant Superintendent in charge of System and School Improvement, and so she will be leading this work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going to be happening as we move forward. This is really the work of this fall. As we think about the comprehensive support and improvement process, we go back to the indicators and the subgroup work that her office is going to be doing, particularly around the targeted support for schools. We do know that in terms of the comprehensive support, that will be on a 3-year cycle. And so once a school is in the comprehensive and identified this coming for the 18-19 school year, again, just a reminder that we have a year of development prior to the implementation of the new accountability and system and school improvement process. So we have some time here that we are going to be analyzing what's currently happening and happened within the school improvement work, and then as we move forward and shifting to the new framework, we will be sending out lots of more information about what we're learning, what the case studies are telling us, what the on-the-ground input is, and then really we know some things about the system that we need to adjust, and that is we have a particular interest in really focusing on the subgroups where we know we have the most need, particularly around our special education and our English learners, working intentionally across the agency with our new Assistant Superintendent of Special Education, as well as our Migrant and Bilingual Office, to really pay attention to those subgroups, because we know predominantly the targeted, the schools that are going to end up in the targeted category are those that have particular need with those subgroups. So if we can work across agency, like most school districts are working across the school district, to really intentionally support those students and close achievement gaps. So Washington will be looking at those subgroups, in particular looking at the targeted support and paying more attention to subgroups that may not have gotten the attention in previous school improvement work, particularly race and ethnicity, and looking at how do we support students that may not have been identified because the N size, or may not have been identified because all of the original spots were taken up with special education and English learners. So I'm going to let Deb explain this wonderful chart and about the timeline of our projected accountability system.
And this is just kind of a big picture. I'll walk through it. It has several rows there, but just to give an idea of previously how it was done was to look at identification. Most recently was done in the 14-15 school year, looking back at 3 prior years, but the data was taking on individual years. So those are the orange boxes up at the upper left. But then looking at going forward under ESSA, looking at the boxes sort of down the center toward the bottom that has the green bar around it, that box is looking at the first round of identification under the Every Student Succeeds Act. We'll be using data from those 3 years, from 14-15, 15-16, and 16-17, for the first round of identifying schools for comprehensive or for targeted support. So then we'll jump ahead, and then in the next round in 2021, we'll be using the next 3 years. That is the blue box at the bottom. We'll use 3 years of combined data starting with the 17-18 school year. So it just gives an idea of how we will stair step forward using 3 years of data. We will report every year a 3-year average, but the identification for comprehensive support will only be once every 3 years. Another piece that I should note is that ESSA allows for identifying an additional statewide category of school for support, and we will have an additional category of targeted support, and that's for consistently low performing English learner progress. So the schools that have the lowest performance on the English learner progress measure will be designated for targeted English learner support. So this highlights that subgroup individually. It is part of the overall plan, but this kind of distinguishes it because it is not, it's a category on its own. So then looking at the participation rate and what does that mean and what does ESSA say around that. So there is a requirement for 95% student participation in the statewide assessments. And so the way that that's sort of embedded within our accountability system is how the proficiency is calculated. That is, it's similar to what we do now. It is what we do now, which is the students who have demonstrated proficiency. So that is to say the number of students who get a level 3 or 4 on the assessment, and that's out of the number of students who were enrolled or number of students who were tested. So there's a little nuance in how ESSA portrays that, but what happens is a school that might have a large number of non-participants, they will have a proportionate decrease in their demonstrated achievement rate. So if they have more students that are not testing, then their proficiency rate will decline. So another part of this requirement for participation is that a school that doesn't achieve 95% participation needs to address that in their school improvement plan. It is also that they may not receive a state or a national award based on elements of the accountability plan. And then if they don't meet that participation rate for 3 consecutive years, the school's accountability rating will be lowered by 1 step. So the exit criteria, I will turn over the microphone. Please, first.
Good afternoon. My name is Gail Pauley. I am the Assistant Superintendent for Federal and State Programs, and work very closely with our with Tennille, who Michaela mentioned earlier, in our Office of System and School Improvement. The next couple of slides talk about the exit criteria that we have to put into place for comprehensive and targeted schools. It's pretty straightforward, because what we're really looking at are those schools that are making growth after they have been identified as comprehensive or targeted. So the 4 different areas for comprehensive include that the school shows improvement over the overall multiple measures, that as they show improvement in at least 1 consistently underperforming subgroup, and that is one of the other indicators. And then the third one talks about that they weren't identified in the next round. So that chart that Deb was going through earlier, if they were identified during any one of those 3 years in which they were receiving support, we would not consider them for exiting. And probably one of the key changes to what we had from the past was really taking a look at, does the school and the district have the supports, the resources to sustain their progress? And so this really focuses on what, as a state, we focus on for supporting the districts and the schools that are identified, the schools that are identified for comprehensive support. But how do we assist them in looking at a plan of action to maintain their growth that they are demonstrating? The second piece is the exit for schools receiving additional targeted support, and there are 2 indicators for those schools. The one has to do with, are the consistently underperforming subgroups, do they show improvement on the multiple measures, and that they also are not being identified during the 3 years that we're looking at them for support, and that the school has, again, a strong plan for sustainability over time, so that there's no backtracking with the groups of students that put them as or identify them as a targeted support school beforehand. And we have one more section that we are required under the federal law to look at, and that is if a school has been in the comprehensive or the target as identified as comprehensive or targeted in the past, what happens if after 3 years they do not meet the criteria that were set for exiting? And so this section is where we are really trying to focus on sustained support system, and Tennille is working on this, and specifically with a pilot that she's doing this school year with priority and focus schools, to help us really look at what kind of support structures between the state, the district, and the school need to be implemented, and to use that information to help us as we're looking at schools that have tremendous growth over time, to help support, to take that information and to put it into place to help our schools that are not demonstrating that. And so we will have to look and identify and continue to work with those schools that do not move out after 3 years of being identified as a comprehensive or targeted school. We will help them, and Michaela mentioned this earlier, help them look at their resources, the funds that come into the district. And the term that we're using right now is rating funds, so that if you have state, local, and federal funds available to you, how do you relook at those funds to really focus them on the support services that a comprehensive or targeted school may need to be successful? And we're also looking at a way in which we can use our on-site monitoring that we've had in place for a long time to really do a deep dive with the school or the district to help them understand what are the barriers that they are facing to make the changes within their schools. And so those are some of the areas that we will be working on as we look at more rigorous interventions. This slide demonstrates the progression as we're working with our comprehensive and targeted schools, that we look at a needs assessment, that we do continuous monitoring in cooperation with the school district. If you haven't had a chance to look at the section of the law that talks about the district's responsibilities in supporting comprehensive and targeted schools, I would ask you to do that. Then we talk about the resources, and this is where the funds come in, which I was mentioning earlier. What kinds of technical assistance is needed to help the schools, to provide to the districts to help them in their support of the schools, and how do we as a state learn from all of the work that we have done in the past and how we work with the districts right now and schools in our pilot process to really learn what is going to work best for supporting the schools. And the last one is what I was just talking about. What do we do when we have to provide more rigorous interventions? So this just gives you an idea of the thinking that Tennille and her team has been doing and working towards. And what will occur over the next year is that collection of information. And Michaela, I think, mentioned earlier about Tennille's going to be out visiting multiple districts this fall to gather information from them as well to help us determine what are the supports that we as a state need to put into place for our comprehensive and targeted schools. As we look at the technical assistance aspect, we're looking at how we conduct our on-site support visits, and that we really focus on what are the needs that have been identified through that needs assessment. We look at how we monitor strategies and how the district helps us in determining what those strategies that are appropriate for the school, because the district and the school staff know that school the best. So we want to learn from them as we work with them through this process. And we're really looking at a systems approach. What are the supports that we need to have in place throughout the school system, throughout the district system, throughout the state system of supports? And the last one, again, is really, I'll use the flashlight, come back to Michaela's first slide on the hammer of the flashlight. What we're really looking at here is a flashlight approach. What can we spotlight on? What has been done well and made change for the students within the schools? And how do we use the resources to effectively bring about those changes? So with that, we have some questions that we're going to go through, and then we'll work on finalizing the presentation today.
Okay, the first question next question we got is, what care is OSPI taking in the translation of the Smarter Balanced test questions to multiple languages to be reflective of the cultural differences a student has when solving questions designed in American English culture? So great question, and actually something that our team here with our folks that work with English learners are working on in conjunction with our BIAC, which is our bilingual education committee that works on these issues and has been an integral part to the work group around our Smarter Balance work. So I'm going to let Deb talk a little bit about what's currently happening, and then we can talk about what we're doing moving forward.
So as I noted before, we do have a translation of the math, a full translation of the math assessment into Spanish, and then some glossary items. But as you note, I mean, it's making sure that an assessment is still valid and reliable when it's translated and for different populations is tricky. So we're just beginning to explore how that will work, but it is a very sensitive issue, and you want to make sure that the assessment is valid as applied to these students in their first couple of years when they could possibly have a translated assessment. So it's something that we're just beginning to work on.
And I think it's important for us to begin looking at this because about 53% of our English learners are actually in grades 3 or lower. So this is something that as we move forward will become more increasingly important to look at across both the math and the language arts assessment. And we have been doing some discussion with members of our BIAC, the bilingual committee, to analyze what really will work at a systems level, state versus local kinds of supports. And I also want to kind of caution that we also don't want to get too many assessments, so that, I mean, that is another push that we're trying to make, is to streamline the number of assessments. So that is a key component to this. I understand, next question is, I understand establishing goals is a requirement, but can you estimate the smooth uniform gain for all identified groups based on no information that such a 90% measure is feasible for everyone at once? Absolutely. So this is, so we all know that learning doesn't happen in that smooth trajectory. Anyone that has taught for any amount of time understands that it is a constantly evolving process, and that kids need different things at different times, and kids learn at different times. And so I think every teacher is in the business to accelerate the learning for all kids, but we all know that it just doesn't happen in that smooth trajectory. So we're working on slides that may better represent this, believe me. But so we also know that the system that we're trying to build is trying to shine a light on the gaps between where the kids are and that level of proficiency, that 90% goal. So I think what's important here is to go back to that disaggregation of subgroups and to be able to ascertain at a local level, where are our gaps? Again, this is system level analysis. So you're looking at this to say, where are our big gaps? And then what local measures can we use to better close those gaps? So again, it's a combination of local measures and these state measures in conjunction to accelerating student learning. It can't be done with one or the other. It has to be a combination of both. And that's where your own local school improvement plan will help combine the measures that we provide at the state level and the local measures, whether those are benchmark assessments or interim exams that you're giving at the local level. Those have to be done in tandem. Next question, why are students experiencing homelessness or students in foster care not included as a priority subgroup? I'll answer it, and then I'll let Deb, I'll give a big, broad answer. The first answer is that those are not included in the federal subgroup requirement. And so one of the things to keep in mind is this is a federal plan to the feds, and we have a state work that is going on to disaggregate in additional subgroups like students in foster care. And we will have a dashboard that is more inclusive than what we have what we're responsible for submitting to the feds. So I just want to distinguish those two requirements. One, what we're sending to the federal government for approval with ESSA versus what we are doing at a state level to produce a dashboard that is as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, just so to further to piggyback on that is that there are requirements, and we do plan to report on those subgroups, but they just aren't included in identifying schools for support. We will be showing that information as possible when there are large enough student groups, but certainly statewide we'll be showing that information, but it's not included in the index, if you will, for identifying schools for support.
So why are schools being penalized for students having the right to opt out of a standardized test system? So this is obviously an argument that we've heard. I think the folks that were writing the ESSA plan also heard this concern. and decided to go forth at a federal level with reauthorizing ESEA with the requirement that we have a 95% participation rate. So this is something that was decided at the federal level. It is now in law, and we are trying our best to acknowledge the concerns at the local level around the opt-out movement, and at the same time hold fast to the federal responsibility that we have to submit a plan that is inclusive of 95%.
And I think we want to revisit or reconsider that it is to look at how the system is doing and identifying those schools that do need the most support, and that if not very many students are taking the assessments, we don't actually have a picture, and we can't tell which subgroups are struggling. We can't tell if we're closing the opportunity gap, so that by having more information, we're better able to provide support where it's most needed.
How does the plan propose to use Title IV dollars to support students' social, emotional, mental, behavioral health? So the exciting part is that we have Title IV funds. So I think that's the first big excitement, is that we actually have funds. People are paying attention to what the federal government is grappling with right now. Well, that's a whole nother issue, but grappling with in particular particular attention to the title programs. It was a good thing that they funded the Title IV program to begin with this year, and that got us launched right now. I think the only other thing I'll say, and I'll let Gail, is that we as a state have been intentional about this from state programmatic resources as well. And so again, going back to that braiding of funds is going to be an important element with this, where we are have a state that and a leadership that is concerned and focused on this. So how can we braid those funds that are currently provided for social, emotional, mental, and behavioral health, which again, the work group was funded again at the state level. So folks should be aware that our social emotional learning work continues to be funded at a state level. How can we combine the work that we're doing locally for the indicators and the professional development that's provided with some of the Title IV funds that are available?
And I would just add, we were really excited about seeing Title IV because it gives us the opportunity to look at the social emotional needs of students with some funding behind it, and some of the changes in some of our state and federal programs as well, and getting back to the braiding. So for example, parts of your Title I funds can be used to support social emotional development and to support students in programs like MTSS or RTI. And then also under LAP, there is a huge segment of the Learning Assistance Program funds that can also be used to help social emotional growth. And we're looking at behavior supports for kids with LAP funding, and our menu of best practices is there. So we have many different component parts that have grown over the last few years that go into actually looking at the whole child and supporting the aspects of the child that sometimes have been forgotten in the past, especially under No Child Left Behind. So it's a real positive shift under ESSA.
So the last question, I think, is I'm concerned about the lack of specific information on, quote, more rigorous interventions. What guarantee can be given that schools ID'd for targeted support are not going to be penalized in their use of resources, evaluating educators, or adding more stringent standards onto students like NCLB? So I'll just go back to where I think this is a good place to go back to where we started with, which is the shared accountability model. Districts, schools will have a lot of say in how they go about implementing these supports and interventions. I will also stress that the disaggregation that we're trying to do within these targeted subgroups, hopefully the state and the district and teachers can see that this is really about closing achievement gaps regarding those indicators, and that we're all on the same team with regard to that, that if it's truly about student learning, and supporting students, that's the focus of this. So we need to shift away from big bad black helicopter OSPI into a place where there is a shared responsibility for all of our students. And that is inclusive of districts, including educators, in how are we going to actually implement the interventions needed to support that disaggregated analysis of subgroups. So I'm hopeful in how we're approaching this. We're doing a thoughtful job in getting out to districts, listening, learning, and then being thoughtful in the approach as we implement in the 18-19 school year. So we want to thank everybody for being on a webinar on a beautiful Saturday, and please feel free to, if there are follow-up comments or questions you have about the plan, you can submit them on the public comment site. That will be open until September 5th. And we also want to emphasize that this is an ongoing process for us. It's not a submit the plan and we're done. We will continue to evaluate and look at how we're doing, the measures. So we appreciate all of your time and thoughtful comments. There's also our contact information up there, so if you want to contact any of us with specific questions or follow-up questions, we're more than happy to answer or get on the phone and talk with you. Have a great
everyone. Have a good weekend.